Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Natasha McEnroe, and I'm the General Secretary of the Society of Antiquaries. And I would like to welcome all of you here today, both those of us in the audience who are here in person in Burlington House and our audience online as well. For those of you who are new to the Society, just to give you a very brief introduction, we were founded in 1707. The bright idea popped into three friends who were having a drink in a pub off Fleet Street, as all the best ideas come to pass. The idea that they would like to form a society for the purpose of investigating and researching material culture, what museum people call objects, the rest of us might call stuff, what we learn from the past through objects. And these can be big objects like buildings, or they can be tiny bits of broken pottery shards. We were awarded a royal charter by George II in 1751. And in 1780, we were given rooms in Somerset House, then shared with the Royal Society. And that was our home for many years until the government then decided that they wanted Somerset House, and Burlington House Courtyard was developed for not just us, but for 4 other learned societies, as well as the Royal Academy that's in the original older part of the building. So we moved in here in 1874, so it's our 150th anniversary this year, which is a nice thing to reflect on. And we are a registered charity. We remain committed to serving our fellowship, who is about 3,020 people who have shown distinguished contribution to the study of material culture in one way or another. But we also do a lot of what's called public engagement, so having our doors open to the public on Fridays. We have school visits, different tours, conferences. Have a look at our website, because all of our forthcoming events and programming is up, and it'd be lovely to see you at future events as well. A couple of notes on housekeeping. In the unlikely event of the fire alarm going off, if you could please follow either me or one of the team, and we're the ones wearing the dark pink lanyards, back out into the courtyard, and we assemble at the statue of Sir Joshua Reynolds, which is rather an appropriate meeting point, I think. Also, those of you who've got mobile phones, if you wouldn't mind just checking that they're on silent and they're not going to go bing at an awkward moment. So today's lecture is All the Worlds on Discs, an introduction to the Vienna Phonogrammarchiv and its historical sound recordings, by one of our newest fellows, Christian Liebl. And Christian studied English, German, and history of art at the universities of both Edinburgh and Vienna. And he later gained an MSc in Library and Information Studies. He was formerly a lecturer at the Department of English at the University of Vienna. And since 1994, he's been associated in various capacities with the Phonogrammarchiv of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, which is the world's oldest sound archive, founded in 1899. He's currently curator of the archive's historical collections and its librarian, and he's lectured and published widely on historic sound recordings. And as I said, he's one of our newest fellows. He's only just been elected to the Royal Society, as a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London. Christian is happy to take questions after his lecture. So without any further ado, I would like to hand over to Christian. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Natasha, for this lovely introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and fellows, both here in Burlington House and online, a very warm welcome to you, and thanks for finding the time amid all the Christmas rush. Before we begin, words of thanks are due. First, to my learned friend Robert over there, whose idea it was to nominate me to become a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London, so he's the one to blame. And second, to the Society, not only for accepting me as a fellow, but also for accepting my paper for a lunchtime lecture. After all, at first glance, this may look like a rather exotic topic for the Society of Antiquaries. But then, in a way, working with historical sound recordings sometimes indeed feels like archaeology, either because the carriers are so fragile or the sound so bad that major restoration is needed, or because so little accompanying documentation is available that we need to dig deep into other archives to find contextualizing information. Moreover, given that historical sound recordings in particular may feature precious manifestations of cultures in terms of language and music no longer in existence today, their preservation is of paramount importance and an obvious case for heritage science. A major, and indeed the first, player in the field of sound archiving has been the Phonogrammarchiv of the Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna, which this year is celebrating its 125th anniversary. But we are not the only ones to celebrate. When I was strolling down Piccadilly a few months ago, I spotted at number 126 this blue plaque I shamefully had never been aware of. It reads, as you can see, in 1899 at 126 Piccadilly, Francis Barrow completed his famous painting of Nipper that became known as his master's voice. And I'm going to quote now from the corresponding Wikipedia entry on Nipper, this dog, which takes us to this building in Maiden Lane, where the year before, Fred Geisberg and the Gramophone Company had opened Europe's first disc recording studio. Quote, on 31st of May 1899, Barrow visited the Maiden Lane offices of the Gramophone Company to inquire about borrowing a brass horn to replace the original black horn in order to brighten up the painting. When Gramophone Company founder and manager William Barry Owen was shown the painting, he suggested that if the artist painted out the cylinder machine and replaced it with a Berliner disc gramophone, he would buy the painting. Barrow obliged, and the image soon became, as you know, the successful trademark of the Victor Talking Machine Company and the affiliated Gramophone Company Limited record labels. But let us now leave London and go to Vienna, to the building whose raised ground floor, Hochparterre in German, has been occupied by the Phonogrammarchiv since 1927. So I believe we really deserve a nice plaque too. The Phonogrammarchiv was formerly located in the adjoining 9th district on the premises of the Department of Physiology of the University of Vienna, occupying two different sites. Why physiology, you may wonder? Well, because it was an eminent physiologist, Sigmund Exner, who was the driving force behind the establishment of the Phonogrammarchiv. On the 27th of April, 1899, the Imperial Academy of Sciences in Vienna held its general meeting in this impressive building, which you may know in the heart of Vienna here, and it is still the Academy's headquarters. It was Sigmund Exner who, together with 5 other Academy members from both the sciences and humanities, and here you can see their signatures in this, founding motion. Now, these 6 members brought forward the motion for founding some kind of phonographic archive in order to make use of the phonograph as a means to preserve the events of the present for posterity. This was to become the Phonogrammarchiv, the world's first sound archive. Even Paris, where similar ideas had been in the air, eventually acknowledged Vienna's pioneering role. Subsequently, sound archives were also set up elsewhere in Europe, in Berlin, St. Petersburg, and Zurich, for example. According to Sigmund Exner, who became the longtime director of the Phonogrammarchiv, the objectives of such sound archive were to systematically produce, collect, and preserve phonographic recordings of European languages and dialects, but ultimately of languages from all over the world, of music, chiefly that of indigenous peoples, and of famous personalities of the day, resulting in so-called Stimmporträts, voice portraits. Over the years, this was accomplished by providing mainly Austrian researchers and expeditions with the necessary equipment as well as technical and methodological advice. In return, they deposited their recordings in the archive, together with the required documentation. The holdings of the Phonogrammarchiv thus consist chiefly of unique field recordings made in the course of research projects, also conducted by archive staff, as opposed to recordings produced for commercial purposes. The recordings come from all disciplines and regions with a focus on ethnomusicology and linguistics, and they comprise some 1,000 languages and dialects, for example. So not quite all languages and dialects of the world, but still quite impressive. In recent years, also complete collections have been deposited in the archive, so that the total playing time of its holdings currently amounts to some 15,000 hours. Geographically speaking, the lion's share is of European origin, over 50%. Africa and Asia are equally well represented, while North and South America are surprisingly underrepresented, but this is simply due to the fact that for many years, Austrian scholars generally seem to have been less interested in these regions and hence did not conduct field research there. If you would like to know more about our holdings, I invite you to consult our online catalog. So to sum up, the key tasks of the Phonogrammarchiv today are to generate, collect, and catalog audiovisual research recordings from all disciplines and regions, to preserve them in the long term, and to make them permanently available, which also includes digitizing obsolete sound carriers like wax cylinders, for example. Catering to the needs of the scientific community, as well as serving the public interest, the Phonogrammarchiv thus significantly contributes to the documentation and preservation of cultural heritage. And this is particularly important if you bear in mind that without long-term preservation, the primary acoustic sources on which scholars in the past decades have based their papers would inevitably be lost. Here now, very briefly, are some basic facts and figures about our historical recordings made between 1899 and about 1950. In other words, made prior to the introduction of magnetic tape recording. Notice the variety of different sound carriers. So in our main collection, we've got the so-called phonogramme. I'll be talking mostly about them in a minute. They result from recordings on wax discs, so not cylinders, but wax discs. Then we've got so-called instantaneous discs. They would be lacquer or acetate discs. Then the well-known 78s, replicated horse groove discs is the technical term, wire recordings, and a couple of wax cylinders as well. So I won't be talking about our shellac discs, but I would just like to point out a highlight from our collection of 78s. And this is the almost complete set of 171 recordings made in the course of the famous Congress of Arab Music held in Cairo in 1932, otherwise only to be found in Paris and London. They entered the Phonogrammarchiv through the good offices of Egon Welles, the Austrian-born British composer and musicologist who spent almost half of his life in Oxford and was himself one of the Congress participants. And here you can also see his signature in our visitor's book from 1934. But let us now focus on the phonogramme, which are at the heart of our historical collections. So when the Phonogrammarchiv was founded in 1899, there were basically two recording and reproduction techniques available. There was, of course, the phonograph, which was invented by Thomas Alva Edison in 1877, and which from 1888 onwards used wax cylinders for recording. The phonograph was easy to transport and hence ideal for field research. However, it had the major disadvantage that initially it was impossible to produce good quality copies. And the more often the cylinder was played, the worse it became. So this is not an ideal prerequisite for a sound archive. The other technique was the gramophone, invented by Emil Berliner in 1887, but this was not really suitable for recording in the field. The wax-plated zinc discs originally used were later replaced by the familiar shellac discs. So the reproduction and recording technique developed by the Phonogrammarchiv's technician Fritz Hauser was a combination of both techniques. The sound was recorded by the so-called Archivphonograph in Edison's vertical cut technique on a wax disc, the so-called phonogram, from which through electroplating a nickel-plated copper negative was taken, which then served as the master for any number of archive discs. And it was the possibility of such copying and hence the preservation of the quality of the original recording that proved an important prerequisite for both the institution of an archive and any further study. And you can see the specimens, the original the wax disc and the master metal on there on the slide. Unfortunately, almost all these archive discs were destroyed during the bombing in World War II, but luckily the negatives, the metal negatives survived, and these new casts made from epoxy resin in the early 1960s are now being digitized for our ongoing edition of the historical collections. Early field researchers, and here you can see one of them, were faced with two major problems. First, the limited duration of recordings, which on average was only some 2 minutes. This means that the continuous recording of songs with several stanzas was thus impossible. Second, the heavy weight of the Archivphonograph. Type 1, there were 5 of them, 5 types. Type 1 alone weighed some 35 kilos. And if we add the accompanying boxes of equipment, researchers had to deal with some 120 kilos. And the photograph here gives you an idea of the situation. Notice, by the way, what the field researcher has got around his neck, so-called listening tubes. We will encounter them later on other pictures as well. So this all made transportation rather awkward, and it meant that the people to be recorded had to be brought to the hotel room where the phonograph had been set up. Not quite the idea of field research. So the construction of later types, such as type 5, was a relief. It only weighed about 9.5 kilos. Especially linguists and comparative musicologists soon realized the importance of the new medium, largely in two respects. First, it offered new research approaches, thanks to the possibility of checking phonetic and music transcriptions through repeated listening. And second, in line with the idea of an archive, it allowed for documenting and preserving for posterity languages and musical performances presumed to be, or in actual fact, on the verge of extinction. So over 4,000 or so historical recordings from our main collection were made between 1899 and 1950, amounting to some 120 hours, and they preserve unique and occasionally lost cultural heritage. Consequently, in 1999, 25 years ago, so there's another anniversary, these recordings were included by UNESCO as documents of universal significance in the Memory of the World Register. And the idea was conceived to publish all of them, which was a novelty in those days. In the past 25 years, 18 series with sub-series have appeared on CD, but since the CD is becoming somewhat obsolete, an online edition is currently in the making. So what are the main objectives of this annotated source edition? Contextualization of the recordings, their interpretation and source critical analysis, which is undertaken thanks to interdisciplinary and international collaboration and collaborative research. Then they are to provide the basis for further research and easy accessibility, dissemination, and repatriation or recirculation are topics increasingly important, and they're all being addressed through this edition. Consequently, as you can see in this diagram, our edition not only makes accessible the digitized sound recordings, which have undergone careful signal processing, but the edition also includes scans of the original documentation, scholarly commentaries, and transcriptions or translations. Here, very briefly, is an overview of the 18 series published so far. You will be happy to know that they can still all be purchased and mostly have booklets in English. And here is the leaflet for you to peruse at leisure, and I've put some of them on the table over there. Blue on this slide here signifies exclusively or predominantly recordings of music. Red, exclusively or predominantly recordings of language, and the rest is of mixed contents. So, as you can see, early field research was carried out not only in Europe, but also, in fact, on all other continents apart from the Antarctica. So hence the title of my presentation, All the Worlds on Disc, which really is more or less true. And the sound samples I'm going to play to you, they all come from the published edition. So the earliest field recording still extant, were made in 1890 by the American anthropologist Jesse Walter Fuchs when studying the Passamaquoddy, a Native American people in northeastern North America. In his prophetic remark, echoing the so-called salvage paradigm, he underlines the importance of the phonograph in the preservation of what today we would call intangible cultural heritage. Quote, as a means of preserving the songs and tales of races which are fast becoming extinct, it is, I believe, destined to play an important part in future researches, unquote. The oldest field recording in the Phonogrammarchiv was made 11 years later in 1901, the year when the newly developed Archiv phonograph was to be tested under field conditions in the course of 3 expeditions to Croatia, Brazil, and the Isle of Lesbos. The first of these expeditions was conducted by Milan Rešetar, a member of the Academy's Balkans Commission and professor of Slavic philology in Vienna, who wanted to study the dialect boundaries in Croatia and Slavonia. In his subsequent report to the Academy, he mentioned the heavy weight of the equipment and the difficulties of finding suitable informants, something that was also experienced by other researchers. And I quote from the English translation of his report, "One had no front teeth, another spoke too weakly or indistinctly, the third was hard of hearing, still others were seized with a fit of laughter when they approached the instrument or were completely mute." So surprisingly, he did manage to make some recordings after all, and we are going to listen to one of them in a minute. But first, it's important to point out that the value of the recordings deposited by researchers in the Phonogrammarchiv crucially depends on the detailed documentation they were requested to provide, the so-called Protokolle, as we say in German. So here is the protocol of our very first field recording, a folk tale recorded on the 20th of May 1901 in Bjelovar near Zagreb. As you can see, it is divided into a header and a free text section. The header contains standardized information such as personal data of the person recorded, location and date of the recording, a brief indication of contents, technical details, as well as the phonographer's name and profession. The free text section underneath contains a transcription and often also a translation. And transcriptions are very important in the case of our historical recordings because of the inferior sound quality. So please be prepared for some noise, which one gets used to after a while, I like to think. So we are now ready to listen to the beginning of another folk tale from the same region, which Rešetar recorded more or less along the way and unsure of its value, a folk tale in Romany. Little did he know that this was to become the oldest known sound document of the language of the Roma extant in Austria and perhaps, in fact, extant in the whole world. So this sounds like this. And you can follow the transcription and translation slide, yeah? Despite all the problems encountered, Receta, like Fuchs, recognized the importance of the new medium and ends on a positive note. Quote, especially for linguistic studies, the phonograph has a great future, allowing to record and preserve for all time the ever-changing human languages and dialects, some of which are also on the verge of extinction. The Academy's second expedition of 1901 takes us across the Atlantic to southern Brazil. It was led by Richard Wettstein, professor of systematic botany at the University of Vienna and director of the Botanical Gardens. It was primarily devoted to botanical studies, but the Phonogrammarchiv jumped at the opportunity and equipped the team with an Archiv phonograph. The expedition was a huge success. Over 300 photographs and some 5,000 plants were taken back to Vienna, and also 9 recordings made in Sao Paulo. They represent not only the very first recordings of the language of the indigenous Guarani, but actually the oldest sound documents from the whole of Brazil. Guarani is today Paraguay's second official language, spoken by some 5 million people. And here now are the words for man, woman, child, boy, girl, parents, father, and mother.
Aba, Bunga, Nintanga, Ulu, Nuyatang, Yadu, Yoruai, Ai.
The last of the 3 expeditions of 1901 was undertaken in the Ottoman Empire on the island of Lesbos in today's Greece. The Berlin Indo-Europeanist Paul Kretschmer, professor of comparative linguistics at the University of Vienna, had been asked by the Academy's Balkans Commission to research modern Greek dialects. Kretschmer not only collected various dialect samples, fairy tales, and proverbs, but was also able to record 3 songs in Mytilene, the capital of the island. Sung by a precentor, a professional singer in church, they are not folk songs, but rather composed songs originating in an urban environment, and probably represent the oldest sound documents of modern Greek produced for scientific purposes. The oldest Greek commercial recordings on discs were made in 1896 in Emil Berliner's laboratories in Washington, D.C. So here is the beginning of the delightful song recorded by Kretschmer in 1901. All in all, Kretschmer, like Receta before him, certainly recognizes the importance of the phonograph. He writes, "It is obvious that it is of great value to record samples of languages that are subject to change, even extinction, in this way for all time, and to make them accessible to those who cannot hear and examine the idiom in question on the spot. And that this goal can be achieved with the new phonograph may arguably already be claimed." Between 1904 and 1905, another expedition, this time devoted to meteorological investigations in India, was equipped with an Archiv phonograph. It was led by Sigmund Exner's son Felix, who was advised also to make recordings. The suggestion to record Brahmins came from Johann Kirste, professor of Oriental Philology in Graz in Austria, who hoped to gain valuable information on the meter and pronunciation of Sanskrit. Consequently, the 68 phonogramme recorded in cities then called Bombay, Benares, Calcutta, and Madras mainly contained Sanskrit recitations, for example, from the Vedas, the collection of religious orally transmitted texts, or from epics such as the Mahabharata, which includes passages from the Bhagavad Gita. More than half of the recordings took place through the offices of Henry Steele Olcott, the co-founder and first president of the Theosophical Society, in the Society's Adyar Library in Madras, today's Chennai. Here you can see a photograph of Olcott at his desk with a picture of Madame Blavatsky, the primary founder of Theosophy and co-founder of the Society. And here is Olcott's voice.
This is the voice of Colonel Henry S. Olcott, President of the Theosophical Society, whose headquarters are at Adyar, Madras. I am very happy to be able to show some courtesy to Professor Smith, Director, President of the Academy of Sciences of Vienna, by assisting his representative, Dr. Exner, in selecting the voices of Brahmins of southern India, was taken to the Adyar Library, who have recited for him verses from their sacred writings and given them with proper intonation. It will be noted that there are various ways of reciting slokas, and specimens of 4 different ways have been given by a skilled pundit.
And at the beginning of Exner's visit to the library, which is where presumably this wonderful photograph with the palm leaf manuscript was taken, the delegation and the phonograph were greeted with the following words in Sanskrit spoken by the library's senior pandit, and we are lucky also to have a photograph of his, which I found in some book. A highly controversial figure in the history of early phonographic field research in Austria is Rudolf Pöch, the physician and anthropologist who eventually, after working as an assistant at the Phonogrammarchiv, became the holder of the first chair of anthropology and ethnography at the University of Vienna. Pöch also advocated the use of the phonograph in ethnology, and during several expeditions, he not only used an Archivphonograph, but also an Edison phonograph, as well as a photo and film camera. In the course of 3 major research projects between 1904 and 1916, he managed to enrich the archive's holdings by 248 recordings, but his methods, which included anthropometric research in Austro-Hungarian prisoner of war camps and even body snatching in Africa, are of course highly to be condemned. And this is also revealed in a book with the telling title, Skeletons in the Cupboard. Before looking at Pöch's 1908 field research in the Kalahari, in what is today Botswana and Namibia, a few words about his first major and self-financed research trip. In 1904, Pöch set out for what is now Papua New Guinea, where he stayed for almost 2 years, based mainly in Potsdam Hafen, Cape Nelson, and eventually Port Moresby. As Austria-Hungary was not a colonial power in this area, Pöch was able to move freely in both the British and German parts of the country. Incidentally, the earliest phonographic activities in this region can be traced back to participants in the Cambridge Anthropological Expedition of 1898, although they were less comprehensive and limited to British New Guinea. In addition to photographs and film recordings, Pöch made a total of 94 phonogramme. And they include not only drum languages, Papuan and Austronesian languages, but also instrumental music, numerous dance songs and musical performances, such as this man's choir. Pöch was lucky, as this group was just one of many who were in Cape Nelson as part of a large dance event, with over 700 participants to celebrate the birthday of King Edward VII. Note how several layers of brown wrapping paper were used to enlarge the horn for the recording of chorus songs, and also note the so-called listening tubes, which we saw at the beginning and which we will encounter again in a minute. The choir singing itself consists only of one word repeated over and over again, and this sounds like this. A minute, how do I get that? Of great linguistic importance is a recording Pöch made 1 year earlier, in 1904, in German New Guinea. It is in fact the oldest sound document of Tok Pisin, or New Guinea Pidgin English, which developed in the late 19th century among Papua New Guineans. It enabled them to communicate not only with Europeans, but also allowed Papua New Guineans from different language groups to communicate amongst themselves. There are, after all, more than 800 different languages spoken in the area. This English-based Creole language has since become an official language of Papua New Guinea and the most widely used language in the country, spoken by some 5 million people. And here is a very short excerpt. A few words now about Rudolf Pöch's primarily anthropological and ethnographic expedition to the Kalahari, in the course of which he made recordings of the indigenous population in today's Botswana and Namibia, as well as photographs such as this one. Note again the use of paper to enlarge the horn of the archiphonograph and the listening tubes in action, which remind us of modern earphones. The 67 phonogramme comprise not only the first recordings of Khoisan languages with their typical clicks, but possibly also the oldest sound documents of polyphony of the Khoisan-speaking peoples in the southwest of Africa. So here is an example. Again, also this expedition involved the use of photo and film cameras, and on one occasion, Pöch recorded simultaneously with the film camera and the archiphonograph. And in fact, you can watch this on YouTube. And I've just given you a picture from this film. 3 years later, in the south of Egypt, whole areas of Lower Nubia were in danger of sinking into the waters of the Nile due to the renewed expansion of the Aswan Dam. Efforts were therefore made to document not only the archaeological sites, but also the language and culture of the people living there, who had to be forcibly resettled. However, it was feared that this would undoubtedly result in the loss of much of their original language and culture, as they would soon be exposed to foreign influences in their new homeland. Consequently, the German priest and Egyptologist Hermann Juncker, who for decades directed Austrian excavations at the pyramids, successfully addressed these concerns to the Imperial Academy of Sciences in Vienna. And he wrote, "In order to save as much evidence as possible for scholarship, I applied to the Linguistic Commission of the Vienna Academy for a Nubian language expedition, during which the languages of the individual districts, the historical traditions, the names of the tribes and places, customs, manners, and songs in the endangered area were to be recorded." Unquote. In the course of this linguistic expedition to Nubia in the winter of 1911, 210 textual transcripts and photographs were made, as well as 14 recordings with the Archives Archivphonograph, including most probably the world's first audio documents of the Nubian languages, Kenzi and Nubian. Indeed, these early language recordings are particularly valuable for today's research for at least two reasons. Firstly, they document an older stage of the language, so that comparisons with modern recordings allow us to make statements about language change. And secondly, songs, poems, and ethnological texts have been preserved that are no longer remembered and would therefore be lost without the recordings. Let us now listen to the beginning of a story in one of these Nubian dialects recorded in the Armene. In addition to Rudolf Pöch, there is another person from the early days of the Phonogrammarchiv to whom we also owe a large number of sound recordings, Rudolf Trebitsch. Born in Vienna, the son of a wealthy silk manufacturer, he graduated as a medical doctor, but hardly ever practiced his profession. Instead, he was more interested in the study of ethnography, where he achieved his second doctorate. Between 1906 and 1913, he undertook a series of entirely self-financed travels, which resulted not only in 262 recordings featuring chiefly folk songs and tales, legends, poems, and instrumental music, but also in a huge collection of numerous objects of ethnographic interest donated to Viennese museums. His experiences as a field researcher, who was allegedly constantly on the lookout for languages and dialects on the verge of extinction, were also reflected in numerous more or less scholarly reports, a monograph, and lectures. Nevertheless, there are doubts about the seriousness of his research, and even during his lifetime, Trebitsch was not without controversy. He was not spared the biting mockery of Austrian satirist Karl Kraus, who complained about, quote, "a portrait of the Greenland explorer Trebitsch in the typical outfit of the Arctic traveler, summer suit, Panama hat, and walking stick," unquote. So the destination of his first expedition, conducted together with the zoologist Gustav Stiasny, was West Greenland. It resulted in 73 recordings, which, together with the recordings from East Greenland made by Danish linguist William Thalbitzer, represent the oldest sound documents extant of the Greenlandic Inuit. The illustrations in his subsequent publication depict some of the people recorded, and here is one of several recordings featuring a variant of the traditional drum songs, which involved men and women singing and forming a circle around a dancer and drummer. They probably represent the only surviving recordings of this kind of performance. It usually took place at night so that the missionaries who disapproved of all traditional singing would not notice. Here, the women were singing while the men accompanied them with rhythmic shouts and some faint drumming. During the summer months of the following 3 years, Trebitsch made numerous sound recordings of the Celtic-speaking population of the British Isles and Brittany, compiling an outstanding collection of Celtic languages and folk music unparalleled in his time, thanks also to the support by renowned linguists, Celtologists, and institutions such as the Royal Irish Academy. And while admittedly modern dialectologists may deplore the absence of spontaneous speech, these unique sound recordings are of great interest also because they feature the voices of numerous prominent speakers, from poets such as Peter O'Leary, a representative of the Gaelic revival in Ireland, or Joseph Guillendre, to famous Celtic scholars such as Joseph Thot in Brittany, and in Wales, Sir John Maurice Jones. While reading mathematics at Oxford, Maurice Jones immersed himself in the study of Welsh books and manuscripts in the Bodleian Library. At the same time, he also attended lectures by Sir John Rhys, the first professor of Celtic at Oxford University, who was actually also among the scholars Trebitsch consulted for his research. In 1889, John Maurice Jones was appointed a lecturer and later professor of Welsh at Bangor University, subsequently publishing important books on Welsh grammar and standardizing Welsh orthography, as well as composing his own poetry. And in 1920, incidentally, he was appointed as commissioner of the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Wales. So here now is the man himself reciting an excerpt from a patriotic epic poem composed by Goronwy Owen, one of the most notable 18th century Welsh poets, who here expresses his longing for the Isle of Anglesey, where John Maurice Jones himself was born.
Yn tembalau, rai, raha, byddin llawn o bob dawn da, yrffydd a chariad perffaith, un yn te can batchwan mai, yn te arlwydd, tramgwydd drwch, digon o bob rhyw degwch, un deb a bob rhyw iawnder, caru gogonedd yn enwa ddydd, da iawn fod, fechan yn afichod, i fyr tinglodd fawr hefyd, ar gyhoedd gan bobroedd byd, ac o ran mai braint a bryd, rhyddod gwir a fyddi.
2 years later, Rudolf Trebitsch not only returned to Scotland and Wales, but also visited the Isle of Man. According to his sources, the knowledge of Manx was in such a decline that the language was surely about to die and would probably be extinct within half a century. And while the last native speaker, Ned Madrell, indeed died in 1974, there have since been successful attempts at a revival. Our 10 recordings were all made in the capital, Douglas, and presumably constitute the oldest sound documents of the Manx language. Here then is the beginning of a story told by John Nelson, proprietor of the Albion Hotel and an indefatigable advocate of the Manx language. He died the following year, and his hotel has since been replaced by a pub.
a sermon for consent again, again, then a, one is being
Let me finally present 3 recordings specifically filed among the so-called voice portraits, the third major group of recordings to be made by the Phonogrammarchiv alongside language and music. Let me begin with 2 British speakers, of whom there are, alas, not many specimens in our historical collections. First, the voice of George Howard Darwin, the 5th child of Charles Darwin and the distinguished scientist in his own right. Appointed Plumian Professor of Astronomy and Experimental Philosophy at the University of Cambridge in 1883, Darwin is chiefly known for his study of tidal forces and his theory that the moon was once part of the Earth, the so-called fission theory of moon formation. An eminent Victorian and much honored scholar, Darwin was a Fellow of the Royal Society, a President of the Royal Astronomical Society, and the corresponding member of several other European academies. His recording, appropriately made on the occasion of the 3rd General Assembly of the short-lived International Association of Academies in Vienna, is a plea for cooperation between the various academies.
I have come to Vienna to the International Congress of Academies, and we have had an interesting meeting. Although the amount of business which we have done has not been very great, yet I am in hope that in a few years' time, this international association will have a great influence. For there are now so many scientific enterprises which demand international cooperation that it is extremely necessary to have one body which is capable of giving an authoritative opinion upon the work of the various enterprises which are laid before the nation as worthy of their support.
The second speaker is Lawrence Binyon, the poet, dramatist, and art historian, still remembered today for his World War I poem For the Fallen. In 1893, he joined the British Museum, where he remained for 40 years, eventually becoming the keeper of the new Department of Oriental Prints and Drawings and an authority on Chinese and Japanese prints. And the photo actually shows him at his desk in the British Museum. Lecture tours took him to many parts of the world, and everywhere his great lecturing skills were praised. Such must have also been the case in 1937, when, already retired, he accepted an invitation from the Albertina to come to Vienna to its Blake and Turner exhibition, as Binyon had written the article on William Blake for the catalogue. He was also to give a lecture on the exhibition and the second one on Chinese painting. While his style of poetry is still untouched by modernism, as he repeatedly described himself as an old Victorian, he showed an understanding for the newer trends in poetry, corresponded with Ezra Pound, and was friends with T.S. Eliot. Remembered by his contemporaries as much the best poetry reader of any of the poets, here now is Binyon reciting the first stanza of his own longer poem, or rather ode, The Sirens, first published in 1924 and inspired by Alcock and Brown's flight across the Atlantic in 1919. As you will notice, this gramophone recording, made some 30 years later than those phonograph recordings you've been listening to so far, is of a much better quality.
Hearken to the eternal lovers rejoicing, a sunrise in their hearts, a music in their veins. Their bodies make sweet singing to one another. They bathe in beams from one another's eyes. They rejoice to belong to the eternal delight, upon whose universe is buoyant their launch, that questions not of its way nor of its haven, but is both way and haven where it hides.
Now for the crowning finale, as it were, let us return to the beginnings of the Phonogrammarchiv. On the 2nd of August, 1903, Sigmund Exner succeeded in making a recording which was meant to attract public attention to the activities of the Phonogrammarchiv. I am, of course, referring to the longest of the 3 recordings of the voice of Emperor Franz Joseph, whom Exner and Hauser visited in his summer residence in Ischl in Upper Austria. The event was communicated to the press, and in due course, a drawing of this memorable occasion, which gives a good impression of the recording situation, adorned the cover of the very popular newspaper Österreichische Kronenzeitung. The Emperor was recorded on 3 discs, and the actual duration of all of them is 2.5 minutes. And in honor of His Majesty, subsequently, the discs received the numbers 1, 2, and 3. The text had been prepared in advance and was actually prompted to him. But on the 3rd disc, which we are going to hear, the Emperor added a sentence off the cuff, starting with one of his famous standard phrases.
Herzlich verehrte Preis auf Wunsch der Akademie der Wissenschaften, meine Stimme in den Apparat hineinzusprechen und dieselbe dadurch Sammlung einzuverweisen.
And I can assure you that it has been also a great pleasure for me to speak to you this afternoon, and I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christian. That was absolutely fascinating. I don't think I can be the only person in the room who literally had hairs standing up on the back of their neck, hearing voices coming out of the past to us. It was absolutely fascinating. I think the scale of the collection, and in particular the fascination with the collecting and examining the development of language globally at that time. I mean, the sheer scale of it is absolutely astonishing. Thank you also for touching on the different development of technologies, which I know would be a lecture in its own right. But no, but also from the point of view of us at the Society, your allusion to the fashions in collecting and how that influences what was actually kept. Now, we've got time for a couple of questions, perhaps. Is there anybody in the room? If we start off with, yes, the lady at the front, and then on to you, sir. Thank you. And then we'll move online.
Can I search your catalogue by place? Because my father came from the Book of Vienna, and it would be very interesting if you have anything from that area.
Well, we've certainly got an online catalogue on our website.
Can I search by place, though?
Yes.
I can.
You can. There's a full text search.
Right.
But if you've got special questions, better address them to me. I'll write an email. I can give you my email later on, because the online catalogue does not comprise all the data we've got. So more detail is available in our in-house catalogue. So do send me an email, please, for any special questions.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for such an interesting talk and demonstration. I'm wondering about the deterioration of these various materials they're made from. What's the problem with wax or the records or the shellac? Are they lasting? Are they deteriorating? Do you need to keep them well?
Well, since the major part of our historical collections consist of these metal negatives, so this metal nickel-plated copper negatives, there's not such a problem of deterioration there. The problem would be perhaps more with later recordings, magnetic tape. But if those are stored properly, again, we should be able to keep them for a long time. But we do digitize everything, of course. We just haven't finished yet. But the thing is, and in fact, this is also true for if you think of books or newspapers. The older you get, the fewer the problems become. Medieval manuscripts, and Robert knows all about them here. They preserve. They can they can last much longer than 19th century newspapers. Yes, and the same here. our phonogramme, you know, they are these sort of metal, the masters, and all you need to do is just to produce new casts, which we did in the 1960s from epoxy resin. This is perhaps not the best material, but the only one we could finance at the time. But we've got these metal, you know, negatives, and so they will last. Yes.
Oh, thank you. It's very reassuring.
Yes.
Thank you.
I think there's a question online, Annabelle.
It's actually just a question from me. I wanted to say thank you so much for sharing this extraordinary collection with us. And I wanted to ask about translation, because you've shared lots of translations into English with us today. And I wanted to ask, was translation part of the process when these things were being collected, or is that part of the collaborative project now?
Yes, mostly it is part of our editorial process. And obviously, you know, much of the material I presented today, I did not research it myself because I'm a philologist of, well, English mostly. And so we had to deal with lots of different languages, and we always have to rely on experts from all over the world. Some of these languages are so rare that there is only a handful of people in the world. So we rely on them, and they very kindly contribute to our edition. And they would also provide translations in the case of the recordings from Greenland, for example. We actually relied on a, well, native speaker of Inuit, or on an Inuit. So we always try to go to the communities themselves and find experts there to help us. The other thing is, also in the case of Trebic, for example, that he often, sometimes you've got translations in the actual original documentation, but that would have been made perhaps at 1 or 2 removes from the original. So we always try to make new translations. We don't rely on the original translations in the documentation at the time. So, yeah, does this answer your question? Yes.
Right, well, that just leaves us to thank Christian again for such a fascinating and well-researched talk and giving us a window into this amazing collection. Thank you, Christian. Our next lecture is on Thursday, the 5th of December at 5 p.m. Warhorse, The Archaeology of a Medieval Revolution by Professor Oliver Crichton, FSA. And our full events programme is on the website, so please do peruse at your leisure, and hope to see you back at the Society very soon. Thank you.